having said all of that, we will continue with what we were doing last week. Last week we talked about kind of how the synod works a little bit generally. We talked about the worship. We talked about some of the elections, kind of how these things sort of are put together. And I left. We didn't quite finish talking about resolutions. Those are kind of the two big things that happen at church conventions: are elections and resolutions. Probably the elections, at least in my mind, are a little bit more important, but they are both important. And I believe we talked for a little bit about this one, to uphold the Scriptural and Confessional Qualifications for the office of the Holy Ministry. And again, this is one of these things that I would call a resolution. This is sort of we're having this conversation, we're spending time on this, but we did, and it was probably a necessary thing. Simply reiterating, why do we have pastors? Who are pastors? How do we get them? And, I mean, that is really at a very simple level what happened. And our process of identifying, training, certifying, calling, ordaining, and placing men as pastors is, well, it's certainly been more or less unchanged in our church body for probably 160 years, maybe. So a fair amount, but really it is pretty unchanged for hundreds and hundreds of years. There may be little variations on how some of the names are used and whether the names are used or not, but it is largely unchanged, I'll say, since the time of the Reformation. We'll talk about that a little bit more.
Pastor?
Yes, Rick.
I don't really agree. I think it's very, very different now, because in old times and past times, people would call a minister and he would either come or not come. But now, they come and visit and see whether they like it.
I suppose it depends on there certainly are differences. I guess it's a matter of what would you consider a big change or a little change. So definitely, I'm going to say even 25 years ago, it was fairly uncommon for, if a congregation, let's say Holy Cross, wanted to call a pastor. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, it was fairly uncommon for congregations to do interviews for pastors, right? So, and that was largely unknown for a fair amount of time. Today, calling a pastor sort of means the congregation forms a call committee. The call committee asks members of the congregation if they have any people that they want to nominate. The congregation informs the district that they have the vacancy and they're going to do a call. The district may put people on the call list, and there's some back and forth that happens there. Ultimately, the congregation then calls the pastor, and that process may involve interviews. It may not involve interviews. And then, once the pastor's called, he may or may not visit before accepting or declining the call, and then he's going to move here. I mean, that's a pretty short summary of how that process works today. 50 years ago, there would have been little or no communication between the congregation and the pastor, other than, are you still alive? Are you still on the roster of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod and eligible to receive a call? Yes or no? And then that would happen by letter, typically. And then the pastor would probably either accept or decline the call, and that would also happen by letter, maybe by telephone. So that's kind of morphed a bit along the way. I know Elaine's father was a pastor. We have any other pastors' kids in here? I don't know. Yeah, Paul, of course. I don't your memories growing up on that process?
Well, I know my dad would go and visit the church first.
Okay, well that's good.
Letter, and then he would go, and visit the church, and then he would come back. And so then I know he and Mom talked about it.
Gotcha. Did Mom go with him?
The family would.
Okay. I mean to visit. When he went to visit, everybody would go and visit? Okay. Okay, interesting. Well, that process is only possible, of course, because of these cool things called automobiles, right? If you were in Wisconsin and you had a call to Baltimore, Maryland, and you were in, and we're talking 120 years ago, you weren't going to go visit because it would take you 2 weeks to get there, just to visit. So that part has changed. Now, here's the interesting part of this, and I'll peek down this little rabbit hole, then I'll pull us back. Rick has always wanted me to go down rabbit trails. 200 years ago, it was absolutely common for the congregation to interview the pastor. That was not only normal, it was required. In fact, if a congregation was considering a man to be their pastor, he would have to come and preach a trial sermon that they would then use as a basis for, is this man orthodox? Can he preach? Or can he stay awake? All of those things before they would extend a call. So, which I've always found rather interesting. Today, it is kind of like that, at least in some respects, because of YouTube. I mean, it's relatively common for pastors to have their sermons published on their church's websites. So I remember when I accepted the call here 5 years ago, that there were people here that said, oh yeah, I saw we were calling someone named Peperkorn, and I looked up on your church's website and watched a couple of your sermons. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing, personally. I think that's a good thing. But that's just kind of my point, is that some of the mechanics have gone back and forth and changed, but the fact is that in our church polity, the congregation chooses a man to be a pastor. There is some process of certifying that this man is qualified to be a pastor. And then he either says yes or no. And that's kind of the super simplified version. Yeah, Larry.
My concern with all this is how it's changed is the two synods that I've been involved with as an adult.
Sure.
Basically Missouri and Wisconsin.
Sure.
Is they have gotten where they're running it more like a company or a corporation. They want their pastors to move every 7 years.
Sure.
And when you go out with different people or what have you, is the pastors have to be, quote, company men.
Sure.
Where
sure.
When I grew up, and it's hard because it's through the lens of a child.
Sure.
Had one pastor that baptized me, took me through confirmation. He stayed the whole time. I knew him not only as a pastor, but I knew him as a person. Okay?
Sure.
And they're concerned, the synods are more concerned with the church becomes the pastor, or the pastor is putting his own slant on it.
Sure.
And even though I understand the merits of what they're saying, anybody that knows me knows I'm suspicious of corporations.
Yeah.
And
There's a cost
yeah,
to that.
And there's something lost in this.
I will say, I don't disagree with anything you're saying, Larry. It was much more common, I'm going to say 100 years ago.
I'm not that.
Okay. It was much more common 100 years ago for there to be longer tenures of pastors. I think, and I had looked this up years ago, that today the average tenure is around 7 years. That's kind of normal. 100 years ago, it was more like 11 or 12 years. So we're not talking about an average of 40 years or something, but it was certainly longer. And there is and I completely agree, there is a cost to that. Please, continue.
That, I don't even know, to be honest with you, if there has a point. I haven't gathered a conclusion on this set of facts, but I'm not sure it's 100% a good thing when it becomes more of a governing body and the churches become like a retail
Franchise. Yeah. Well, and that is, again, always the tension, is that our congregation is a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Okay? So, we are not the Missouri Synod. We're a congregation in a specific place, at a specific time, with a specific ministry where God has put us here in Rockland. In order for us to do what we do, we determined long ago that there are some things that it is much better to do together than separately. Having a church 100 miles from here help us teach Sunday school doesn't make any sense, right? Because that's right here. But having a group of people to gather together to train pastors does make a lot of sense. And whereas that isn't necessary at the congregational level. So that's always I think always an interesting tension. And you sort of kind of get that at synod conventions, I would say, is that everybody who's sitting that's a delegate, they are all either pastors or lay people in their congregations. So they all kind of see things from the congregational point of view. And then for a week, have to sort of, okay, I'm going to lift up and try to look at this from the 50,000-foot view, and not from the in the weeds view. And that is hard to do, no question about it. Richard.
A comment and a question.
All right.
Growing up in the 50s and 60s, and then as I being adult in the 70s, I had a different experience with pastors than Larry did. The pastors I interacted with did in fact do fairly often.
Fairly often.
The pastor that I started with in 7th grade confirmation, he moved about 4 or 5 times and wound up in Paradise, California.
There you go.
And
took him that long to get to Paradise.
and in fact, my parents became good friends with his wife. And the question is, given these comments, I always thought, okay, the pastor goes, but prayerful consideration of where am I best served.
Sure.
So it seems like that's sort of a contrary concept to, as Larry called it, the corporate concept. This maybe put you on the top. Where does this come into the fact to play that a pastor prayerfully considers where he's best fit to serve at that moment in time?
Oh, that's a great question. Having been at least on the pastor's end of that, and I do think that there's a very close parallel to what the congregation does in a call process too, by the way. As a pastor, I receive call, I have to consider where are my talents and abilities going to be best served? Where is this going to be of best service to the church? I'll say that there are push considerations and pull considerations. Are the things going on in my current congregation that would say this would be a good time for me to move? Maybe we've just completed a building program, or is the current congregation in a position where moving would be advantageous? Because sometimes it is a good thing for a congregation to have some change in leadership, in my opinion at least. So that's kind of a part of it. And then the pull thing is, what is it about the newly calling congregation that says, oh, this is some place that I can contribute. They have needs that I can fulfill. That kind of question. So there's push and pull, and I will say that's I'll say on the one hand that's from a ministerial point of view, you know, from me as the pastor. And I have to look at these things and pray about them and kind of, and also recognize my own, and kind of realistically recognize my own skills and abilities and weaknesses, right? And kind of do that. Now that is also exactly what the congregation does in the process of calling a pastor. The congregation, you get a name, a list of a dozen or 50 names or however many names, and then say, okay, why do I think this guy would be good for us and that guy wouldn't be good for us? Right? Well, you get a dart, see where it lands. What are you looking at? And, you know, you're going to look at the person's teaching and preaching, at least from what you're able to learn about that. You're going to look at what other people say about them. You're going to look at kind of reputation in some capacity or another. You're also going to look at, does this person have the experience and the kind of experience that would benefit us? All of these sort of things. There's a ton of them. You may also look at little things like, can we afford him? Because if he's a pastor that's been a pastor for 10 years, he's going to cost X. If he's a pastor that's been a pastor for 40 years, he's going to cost Y. And that X to Y may be a big number, right? And so as a congregation, you have to look at those very practical things and say, maybe we want the guy with 40 years experience, but we can't afford him. And so it would be unfair to our congregation and to him to say, okay, we're going to call you, but we can only pay you 6 months of the year. Or what? I mean, that would be difficult. So you have these very concrete things. And in the same way, the pastor has to look at those very mundane things and say, okay, can I afford to live and provide for my family based on what I'm able to receive in that place? It's just that simple. And either you can or you can't, and you've got to use the best judgment that you can. That's not an easy process. I agree. Now I see a couple hands, and I will entertain a few questions on this. Then we're moving on. Rick.
Yeah, I think it really was a rabbit hole because we do all agree and understand how pastors are called, but the point seems to be in this resolution that a pastor is one who preaches and administers the sacraments publicly. And then we go down to part 2, and we're talking about lay deacons.
Yes.
And so
which we have not gotten to
and
yet.
I assume that the purpose of this resolution was to be very careful as to what a deacon does and is. Period.
Yeah, and that's always the case with these things. The purpose of this specific resolution was to look at this question of qualifications. That's kind of the magical word in this resolution. Is what are the qualifications for being a pastor? Husband of one wife, apt to teach, kind of going through this biblical list. Yes.
My question is, a pastor not accepts, but he responds to a calling. All right, now he's being interviewed, and he's surmising whether he wants to take this position on or not. Is there a time frame involved in all this?
Is there or should there?
Either way.
Well, the time frame is kind of, there's no law, I'll say that. Okay, so there is no, if you do not respond by X, then, then the call is automatically rescinded or something like that. The common convention would be that if a congregation calls a pastor, typically a pastor should take no more than a month to make a decision. I think a month would be considered pretty normal in the Lutheran Church conservative for that process. So if it takes dramatically longer than that, there really ought to be some special circumstances involved, like, well, you called me on the day that I was going on a month-long vacation, and I'm going to be in Zimbabwe for a month. When I come back, I'll look at the call. whatever, there ought to be, I would say that that would be the norm, but there is no laws that I'm aware of. And I certainly know of cases where a pastor has held on to a call for 2 months or 3 months or something, and it really becomes kind of contentious, and I'm going to say that's a lousy way to begin. So I'll leave it at that. Mary?
This refers back to what Mary mentioned.
Sure.
Synods,
Yeah.
so-called policy, if there is one. Now, you pointed out this is your 5th anniversary here, and that's hard to believe.
I did. Believe me.
So would you expect in a couple of years you'd start feeling pressure from Synod or anything? Looking around, or how do you know?
It's a good question.
What do you do?
I would say, well, first of all, I can't predict the future. That's not in my call document, by the way. Predicting the future, not one of my skills. I would say, broadly speaking, okay, it would be typical for a pastor who has been at a place more than 3 to 5 years that congregations who would be calling would say, okay, he's been there long enough that maybe you would consider a call. I would say broadly speaking. I don't think that that's the case from necessarily from the Synod's point of view. There is no, if there is, I've never seen it or known of any sort of manual or something like that that says once somebody has been in a place for a certain amount of time, they're automatically put on call list or something like that. If it is, I don't know of it. So I would say that I suppose it's possible, but I am neither looking for nor expecting it. So I'll answer that. Okay. Having said all of that, let's move on. All right. I'm gonna come to the licensed lay deacons thing, but I'm gonna wait until the end, and I'll explain why in a minute. This was another resolution to adopt a Lutheran identity statement for Concordia University institutions as prepared by the Concordia University presidents. Our church body, Lutheran Missouri Synod, has 10 universities and colleges that are owned and operated by our church. Being Germans, we have given them all the same name. So they're all named Concordia. So on the West Coast, we have Concordia University in Irvine and Concordia University in Portland. Those are kind of the two that are out here. There are, I think, 6 of them that are in the upper Midwest. Let me see if I can. Seward, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Mequon, Michigan, Ann Arbor, Chicago, which is where Evelyn Yee attends. I feel like I'm forgetting one of those 6, 7. I'm forgetting one. I probably offended a whole group of alumni there. And then there's one in Selma, Alabama, and there's one in Bronxville, New York. So they're kind of all over the country, but they are primarily in the upper Midwest. The ongoing challenge for all of our Concordias, and honestly, I would say that this is true at the university level all the way down to the preschool. Okay? So while this is something that they deal with at the university level, it is in our own way exactly the same thing that we deal with our academy and school here. And that is, what does it mean to be a Lutheran institution? What does it mean for us to have Holy Cross Academy that is owned and operated by Holy Cross Lutheran Church? That's basically the question. And that question is the same question that is asked at all of these universities. Because, again, 150 years ago plus, when these institutions started to be formed, the first one was in River Forest, I think the second one was in Seward, Nebraska. They were formed either to train pastors or to train teachers. That was their initial purpose, was to train, I'll say, to train church workers in some way or another. As that has kind of morphed along and moved along, other programs have been added in, so that today, at all of the Concordias, I do not believe that church workers are the majority of students at any Concordia. It may be at Seward. I think that would be the only place. But even there, I don't think it is. I think it is less than half of what you're talking about there. So you have all of these other programs. You know, you're going to have engineering programs, and biology, computer science, business, art, etc., which is great. And I'm totally in favor of it. So what does it mean to run an art program at a Concordia? Does that mean that we can only have Lutheran art? That is a hard question to answer. This question of identity and the relationship between the church and its schools. Now, this is something that's actually literally at the very heart of Lutheran identity, because Martin Luther was a university professor. He taught at the University of Wittenberg. That has been a part of our sort of identity and from the very, very beginning of Lutheranism. And again, that is not something that is easy to get. So broadly speaking, there is a tension toward, I'll say, toward secularization at the schools, and to sort of disconnect the programs from that core identity. And how to keep that closely aligned and integrated is what this resolution is trying to do and deal with. Does that make sense? I seriously find it very interesting that this is the thing, that the tension that we feel, if you're talking about elementary schools, preschools, high schools, colleges, seminaries. You know, if you were to look at schools that were started by churches in the 18th and 19th century, the vast majority of them are not Christian today in any meaningful way. Harvard,
They have
Yale.
a church.
Pardon?
They still have a church.
They still have a church, but those places often, and Marion, of course, has much more direct experience with those places than I do. They still have a church and there's still a tie, but at best it is typically a program of the institution, not the point of the institution. So there's some interesting tension there, and we kind of are going against the grain by having and maintaining all of the schools that we do. There are a lot of people in our church body that would argue we, as the Lutheran Church of Missouri Synod, do not need 10 schools. As a church, we don't need 10 schools to train teachers and pastors, or even to kind of do many of the other things. And so we're kind of stretched too thin, given our needs. But having that conversation is particularly painful, because that means, are we going to close the school? You know, how do you determine that? Oh, it's very emotional, very quickly. Ben?
Does this resolution have any impact on things where you hear about Concordia's teaching questionable theology?
Well, that's always going to be the thing, is that you kind of get anecdotal knowledge or evidence of something happening at this or that Concordia and say, how come they're teaching this or that at this place? And a lot of time that comes down to a question of staffing. Maybe the staff member isn't Lutheran, you know? That's entirely possible. Maybe even likely, depending on the department. And so I would say, again, broadly speaking, what this is trying to do is sort of establish a baseline of what does it mean to be a Lutheran university. That's the attempt. Ultimately, I think it would try to help with those sort of questions, but I think that's a long way down the road. Larry?
Well, we're going through this conversation on where to apply for colleges with my daughter.
Sure.
And we're talking about Concordia, but one of the issues is there seems to be a real tension about histories and sciences in a religious college. She wants to do sciences and do research. So the question is will they retard it? She wants a good education.
A good liberal arts education.
But she's nowhere near, atheist or agnostic
Right.
or what have you.
Right.
But
Can you actually be a scientist and be a Christian? I
Right.
think so.
And
But that's
so-
not an easy answer. I agree.
Right, and so these are the questions she'll apply, but I don't think when she gets acceptances, it will be her first choice because of this tension.
Well, and that is exactly from the student's end of things, kind of the, why do we have program X, Y, Z? And what does it mean to have program X, Y, Z? And how? I don't have any brilliant answers for you on that, Larry, other than to say, I'll be there in about a year and a half. So, maybe less.
Well, I want to go,
Yeah,
but I'm not going to be able to make
Right.
this decision for her.
Any other questions about this resolution, or this kind of, as I said, we're just sort of doing one of the big things that they talked about. That's really my goal here. All right. This is a very exciting one. One of the most painful and contentious topics, for as long as I've been a pastor, in the church has always been the question of conflict resolution. Isn't that a surprise that conflict resolution is a very conflicted topic? And what this tried to get at was a sort of loophole in our dispute resolution process. And the loophole, as I understand it, was basically if there was a district president that for whatever reason did not want a particular case to move forward, he could sit on it and it would just essentially die. So there was no kind of deadlines for dealing with things, or not nearly as clear as it ought to be. And so what this tried to do was clarify the appeal process, so that if there is a conflict resolution case and a district president fails to act within a timely period, I think it's 60 days, then the accused may appeal to kind of further up the chain. That's a very rough outline of what this is dealing with, but and we're very blessed here. Not to my knowledge, we've never had to go into any kind of dispute resolution process either as a congregation or any of us church workers, which is really good thing, believe me, because it's paperwork galore. But that's the sort of thing that you look at, and it's very easy for us to look at this or something like this and say, well, that just really seems like kind of boring, bureaucratic, pain in the neck stuff. And it is kind of boring, bureaucratic, pain in the neck stuff, unless you're the one in the middle of it.
You should give examples of that.
Well, let's say, for example, that I have to think of a good example. Let's say that a pastor is accused of teaching a false doctrine. Okay, but that the accusation is made by somebody who doesn't like him and just wants to make his life miserable. Well, in a case like that, there is a set procedure for how that is handled. Okay, and if in the process it goes to a certain point in the appeals, and then that person says, okay, I'm just going to leave this person hanging, and we're not going to touch it for 9 months. Now this person's stuck in limbo. Their reputation may be at stake. Their livelihood may be at stake. All of these things may be going on. This is, I would say, parallel to in our Bill of Rights, the requirement, the right to a speedy trial, an expeditious trial, that sort of thing. Now, how well that's played out is a whole other question, which I shall not get into because that is above my pay grade. the kind of thing. Or it could be an accusation of immoral behavior. It could be a dispute between a congregation and another congregation, or a district president and another district president. I mean, there's just all kinds of things that fall under this. Some of them are theological, some of them are moral, some of them are very sort of procedural things. You know, I can think of a dispute resolution case where a pastor started a special fund to help with some sort of rescue emergency mission, and was going around the district, and it was creating all kinds of tax problems, and it was just a huge mess. Well, there's an example of, all right, so how do you fix this? So that's kind of, again, broadly speaking, how this is going to play out. I honestly don't know if this is the case, but probably in the last 3 years, the most public and vocal case that our church has dealt with was a professor that was originally at Concordia, Portland, and then ultimately was at Valparaiso University, a professor that did not teach that the Bible is the Word of God, the inerrant Word of God, said that Adam and Eve were a myth, the flood didn't happen, you know, publicly promoted women's ordination, all kinds of things. And this process took years to try to deal with. And I think I would be pretty comfortable saying was not handled in an expeditious fashion. And so those are the kind of things where it's sometimes
that was
just
the
gets missed.
district president.
But that was a case where the district president, as I understand it at least, was essentially covering for him, and did not want to deal with it because he didn't want the case to move forward. So when there's no deadlines, then he's back to going forever. Richard.
What are the scope of the employees? Is it pastors, deacons, call workers, or any employee of the university?
Our Synod's dispute resolution process, this is kind of a very narrow and specific thing, means that only a member of Synod may enter into a dispute resolution process. So what that means is any called and rostered workers, so pastors, called teachers, deaconesses, etc., a congregation as a whole, because Holy Cross Lutheran Church is a member of Synod, but Walt Wismar is not a member of Synod. He is a member of Holy Cross. So a congregation as a whole, I believe any called employee of Synod. So, so if someone is a receptionist at the International Center and they have a conflict with their boss, they don't enter into dispute resolution. They deal with whatever the process is with the HR department at the International Center. So this is generally dealing with members of Synod as a technical term. Yeah. Any other questions? I'll try to answer as best I can. This is an interesting one, and I like this one for a lot of reasons. This is a resolution that appeals to the congregations in Synod to use the liturgy. I mean, that's really very simply what it does. Is it says, for the sake of the unity of the church and by the mercies of God, we appeal to the churches of the Missouri Synod to use the liturgy and to follow the ordered service that we have in our hymn books. That's really what it does. And the reason why that is an appeal is that the Synod, as a Synod, cannot require or force a congregation to do anything. You know, the Missouri Synod, for instance, couldn't come in and say, we think that your mission budget ought to be $100,000 a year, and so we're going to make you do that. The Synod doesn't have any authority over our budget. Nor does the Synod, as Synod, have any authority over what we do in worship. Having said that, by being members of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, we have agreed to walk together and to work together. And so what this is saying essentially is, for the sake of love and unity, let's do together what we have commonly agreed upon. So I really like this resolution, especially because it's not pretending to be able to force congregations to do what they want, to do something. It's recognizing the rights of congregations, but at the same time, it's appealing to what would be best for the church. Paul?
How big a problem is this?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have I couldn't give you some sort of nifty percentage answer, but I would say, broadly speaking, 100 years ago, maybe 50 years ago even, maybe even 40 years ago, you could go to just about any congregation in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, walk in and participate in the service, and you would know what the liturgy is. It's page 5 or 15. That's what it is. And you know, maybe this congregation knows these hymns and this congregation knows that hymns, or there would be some variation, but the amount of variation on what happened place to place, Sunday to Sunday, was very unified. Not 100%, never been 100%, but very unified. Today that is much less so. Now, some of that, I would argue, is for very good reasons. We are in a much more diverse society than we were 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. I would not expect among congregations to be using LSB in English because they're members of the Missouri Synod. That would be silly and would be absurd, or whatever language. That's kind of my point. So we are in a much more diverse culture than we once were. Having said that, the tension does not generally lie in cultural diversity. It tends much more to lie, I'll say, in theological diversity, and how good or bad that theological diversity is going to vary from place to place. So I mean, I know that's a little bit of a cop-out on my part, but I do think that continues to be a challenge for us as churches, and honestly, probably more so on the West Coast than it is in the Midwest. As I said, how good or how bad that is, I'm gonna leave for another conversation. But I would say, generally speaking, that's how I would approach it.
I'm just finding the last few years in my job, they always have, when we're gone on the weekends, they always have church services, predominantly Catholic.
Yeah.
But when I go to them, the shocking thing to me is how all of them seem to use the same liturgy with a different tune or a different rhythm. So I'm a little bit surprised that there's even this conversation, because the Baptist ones, the Assembly of God, and the Catholic ones, I walk in, it's pretty much the same words. It's just a different rhythm, a different tune.
Yeah, and I think that is true to some degree. I don't, however, believe that what this resolution is talking about is music.
But the words are the same.
I think that you are exceedingly optimistic in that assessment.
Okay.
And I'm sure you always get called an optimist, Larry. So I'm sorry, it just slipped out. I couldn't. All right, I'm going to keep moving here because I do want to deal with this one. So this one kind of circles back to that question of qualifications for the office of the ministry. Let me give a little bit of kind of background to this question. In 1989, so that's almost 30 years ago, in 1989, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in convention authorized what was called the Licensed Lay Deacons Program. Okay? And what this was intended for was primarily to assist congregations in in rural and out-of-the-way areas to receive some level of pastoral care when, because of either cost or distance, they were not able to afford a full-time pastor, or maybe even a part-time pastor. That decision at the time was very controversial, because what it did was create essentially another category where you have pastors who are the ones who regularly preach, teach, baptize, do these pastoral works. And that kind of has been the case. And we're not talking about emergency circumstances here. That is kind of a different topic, I would argue. But now you had district presidents that could authorize someone to do these specific pastoral acts, especially celebrating the Lord's Supper, when they were not a pastor. When they were quite specifically not a pastor, not training to be a pastor, not planning on that in any way. So that was this program called Licensed Lay Deacons, and that has been a kind of a thorn in our church for 30 years. When it began, it was you were talking about literally maybe a couple dozen cases. But today there are some districts that have made wide use of licensed lay deacons, and not in out-of-the-way rural areas, but essentially as ways for congregations to get people to do pastor stuff, and where it was cheap. Because if you could license someone in your congregation to do it, it would cost $100 a week instead of actually having to pay a salary and deal with all this education stuff. Well, that's really good for the budget. And I mean, there's more to that, but because it's not simply about money. But that concept of can a district president license someone to do these things? That is really the underlying question. And there were many pastors, certainly myself included, that saw that not simply as a matter of kind of necessity because of circumstances, but as a matter of us violating our confessions, what we say we do as Lutherans. Because Article 14 of the Augsburg Confession says, "It taught among us that no one should preach or teach or administer the sacraments without a regular call." I mean, that is one of the foundational documents of what it means to be Lutheran, and is that these things are done by people that have a regular call. That means pastors, and that's kind of what we commonly agree to as Lutherans on how this is to work. So that's kind of the short version of it. What this resolution seeks to do is say, first of all, that district presidents can't license people to do this anymore, new, and that there is going to be a process put in place to the men who are currently in this, serving in this capacity, will be called and ordained. And that it's going to be a little messy for a while, but we're quite used to messy. But that the end goal being these men are going to be called and ordained as pastors. That was sort of the compromise that was reached at the convention. Some people were satisfied with it. Some people were unhappy with it on either end of that. It so happens that our pastor delegate, Pastor Shaw from Grace and Grass Valley, was on the floor committee that wrote this resolution. So that was quite convenient, and we actually have a pretty good source of information for that. I was hoping that he was going to be able to come to Bible classes.
He's walking in now.
Yeah, but we're out of time. So if you have any questions about that, that's a super short as we are able, if we have time. Also, next week, our Higher Things youth group is going to give us a little presentation on what they did in Fort Collins at our Higher Things conference. So that should be a lot of fun. I hope you will be there for that. That should be a good time. I'm quite confident that Diane is standing here hoping to exhort you to be Sunday school teachers for this coming year. Am I right, Diane?
Yes, we still need four more teachers to complete our staff.
Okay.
And consider it's a blessing and a gift and a joy to be working with the children of this congregation. It's also our responsibility to promise to support families in their raising their children, to be knowledgeable of who God and Christ are, and to learn the Bible and to know God in that way. And so if you will prayerfully consider how you might be able to just this year maybe teach for our children.
Thank you very much, Diane. Sign-up sheet's right over there above Mr. Matheson, and you can talk to Diane or myself afterwards if you'd like. Let's close this benediction. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all. Amen. Thank you, everyone.